This week on Crunch Week, Airbnb is legal, Satya Nadella puts his foot in his mouth, and Snapchat users get hacked. Okay, so with the Airbnb news this week, I feel like you've been paying the most attention. So why don't you start us off by filling us in on what's the important details to know coming out.
So San Francisco is Airbnb's home turf. You know, it was founded here in 2008. It was done on, a bunch of air mattresses when, Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia and whatever, there was a design conference and they needed to make some extra cash and all the hotels were booked out. And, fast forward 6 years later, it's a company that's now worth, $10 billion and more than certain hotel chains like Wyndham and whatever. But San Francisco just hadn't figured out, should we legalize it? How should we legalize it? Should it be, it will be regulated. How should it be regulated? And it was a really tough question. It was a process that took a couple years to figure out. And this week they finally both legalized and regulated Airbnb with a very controversial piece of legislation. It'll be very actually interesting to see if what they passed this week stays going forward, because there's another group that was threatening to put initiative on the ballot with a much stricter form of regulation.
The vote was 7-4, I think it was?
Yeah.
So it was still pretty, it wasn't a unanimous decision by any means.
No.
Okay.
Yeah. But basically what it enables the city to do is if you are doing a non-hosted rental, you can do it for up to 90 days a year. If you're hosting, which means you're present, you can, there's no cap on that. And there's a bunch of stipulations that are meant to protect rent-controlled tenants. For example, if you're in a rent-controlled unit, I don't believe you can, charge more than what you're paying your landlord. And also, if you, also it doesn't supersede lease agreements. So if your lease agreement says you can't do short-term rentals, you can't do short-term rentals, period. Otherwise, you're at risk of eviction.
Oh.
Yeah, I was there. Yeah.
So you were there for both sides presenting, I assume? Or how did that work?
So the way it worked was this piece of legislation, David Hsu had been working on it for a long, long time, and it passed through the Land Use Committee last week, and then they discussed it, and all the different supervisors on the board had there was more than a dozen amendments that they wanted to add because they were concerned that it wasn't enforceable, and there were some concerns that there's a part of the board that wants Airbnb and other short-term rental companies to pay back taxes, which they think amount to about $25 million.
Did Airbnb have any arguments saying, this is going to negatively affect our business, or this is going to change how we operate?
The funny thing is Airbnb really, as a company or as an entity, really hasn't been. The company itself hasn't really been physically present throughout this process.
But if the law was bad for them, they would have been, right? I mean, if they're hanging back on the sidelines going,
No. This is actually really interesting politically, because there was this group, Home Sharers, which is kind of Fair to Share, Home Sharers, that was kind of related to them, but wasn't officially them. That was literally present at every single meeting. So they had this whole group of hosts or people who may work for the company, who knows, who were around at every single step of the process, kind of lobbying supervisors.
So it's
their front group.
So it's if Uber had sent in a group of super passionate drivers to do all their lobbying.
Or I don't like Muni Inc. Basically.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's actually a really politically, it's an interesting thing because this is a class. This is a battle where a lot of groups that you wouldn't think would ever be on the same team, were on the same team. And so you had groups like landlords and housing activists on the one side who were this legislation is flawed, and then you had this whole other group of home sharing folks who were probably Airbnb hosts or may have been officially affiliated with Airbnb in some way or another, and they were just both groups are very, very, very present throughout the whole process and throughout all of the hearings.
But the rules aren't enforceable. The 90-day rule is not being tracked by anyone. It's the job of the person who's renting out their space to keep track of the 90 days, and there's no actual penalty for this. That if they
there's financial penalty.
How are they going to
This is actually a pretty serious question, because it's so they did change some stuff to the legislation to make it more enforceable. There are certain housing nonprofits who have been around. They have to have been around for a certain number of years that can proactively go after hosts that are violating the law. And before that wasn't possible. So there's a certain group of people that can file suits. They can't get any civil or financial returns from that, so they're not financially motivated. They really have to be going out to looking. They have to be looking after, are there rent-controlled units that appear to be have been taken out of the market full time for short-term rentals, and can we sue the host for that? and have a private right of action. So that was actually put into the final piece of legislation.
What percentage of offenders of rules like that or the 90-day rule will actually be busted for it?
I don't know.
Year? I mean,
that's huge. We might actually have to amend the whole thing, because like this is actually a pretty, one of the things that has been incredibly frustrating about this whole process is how the lack of transparency from Airbnb itself. They have not provided any data. Like the city's kind of operating in the dark. They don't know. Nobody really knows. Like how many units are on there? How often are they rented? Like what's going on? Like how large is this phenomenon?
They didn't have to show up. They had the little paid group of people to go around.
So I know you're being really enthusiastic about talking today. So let's go to a topic that you are most familiar with. Let's talk about Satya Nadella and his. I like Kara Swisher's description of this unfortunate statement.
She only called it unfortunate. Is that what she called it? Okay.
I think she's being sarcastically nice, given Kara's personality. If that's kind of where we're at. So so this week at the Grace Hopper celebration, I think it's called, down in Arizona, Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, gave a basically 2-hour interview, almost 2 hours, and at the 1 hour and 35-minute mark, he was asked what young women should do in terms of asking for a raise, and he gave quite possibly the worst answer to any question since Rick Perry said "oops" on stage during a debate in 2012. It was catastrophically bad. He said essentially women don't ask for a raise.
We shouldn't ask for a raise.
Should not.
It's good karma not to.
The system will take care of you. And in fact, women not asking for a raise is a superpower. Exactly. The more he talked, the worse it got. It was incredibly bad. And the reaction, as you noted, Kim, was immediately negative. And
well, I mean, she was corrected immediately by the Harvey Mudd president, who said that she, that hadn't been her experience at all, basically.
It was just amazing to me to see any person, any adult person, educated, intellectual. He's known for being an intellectual and writing in a bunch of references into his 3,000-word memo to employees. But he says, like, just that the system will work for you. Who actually thinks in that way? Like, no, trust the system. I don't know any adults.
The system is consistently broken. I mean, there was a great story in Times today, like referring to all these different business studies about how often women ask for raises, and I think there. I mean, I can't remember the exact statistics off the top of my head, but I think, like, it was Claire Kane Miller's story. She was saying that men, on average, in a particular Harvard Business School study she was looking at, got 7% higher starting pay or whatever, because like more than half of them asked, negotiated for higher salaries versus like a much smaller portion of women. And
there's also weird systemic biases where a man who like has a child is promoted because he has a family that he has to support now, while a woman, her career can be like shunned or hindered by the fact that now you might have time to take off.
It's flipped.
Yeah.
And instead of taking this moment on stage to say, at Microsoft, we don't have that sort of bias, we actively support and encourage women in technology, especially on the technical side of things.
Or we've studied the issue, and we are working on these programs to like, there was a program even announced like this week, like, was it Facebook? And it was like a mentorship program for women internally in the company.
All this opportunity and then all this catastrophic failure. And I think there's a debate between, should we castigate him for what he said or for what he thinks? And I think that's an important distinction, because if we just say he shouldn't have said that, then we're not saying he shouldn't have thought that.
I'm worried that, like, with a gaffe like that other, male leaders in the industry will just feel a lot more apprehensive at speaking at events like this. Because, I mean, these are conversations that we need to have happen. Like, people are going to say things that are messed up, but it's worth knowing that people think those things, so we can have a discussion about it, we can talk about it, and we can correct those kind of cultural biases inside the industry and inside companies.
Yeah, I think for Microsoft itself, this is a really, really bad day. I mean, their CEO had a very strong rollout. He wrote these ridiculous long memos, but I mean, overall, things were going well internally. Right. The layoffs were taking well, morale was good, new products, new operating systems, new devices. The CEO had a good honeymoon period, and then faceplant. Just splat. I don't even know what to say.
So I guess going forward is the issue, like, do we need to have safe spaces for these CEOs?
I don't. How do you
create environments where we can say?
I've been trying to think through. I mean, I feel like I don't know how. I'm not used to working in like enormously large institutions or corporations, but I do think, at least, like, when I think about the Valley and a lot of the startups, I feel like maybe we should have a conversation about, incubators. If you go through a startup incubator, or if you take money from certain VC firms, like training about how to make like a woman-friendly workplace, in addition to all the like services and support that like VCs are now giving in terms of marketing or whatever. Maybe that should be a standard thing. Like,
I think it's a very reasonable point.
Yeah.
especially given how bad it is. I mean, this isn't a small problem we can fix with one or two programs. This
Yeah.
is an industry-wide issue that is, I think, now coming to light more, but we've known about it for a long time and done nothing about it.
Well, I mean, with all the small companies, it's like there's like it feels like an order of magnitude more companies than there were like 5 to 10 years ago, and a lot of those things, those companies, startups, are being run by very young people who don't have a lot of experience with HR practices, professional HR practices, and I'm like, you know, if Techstars or Y Combinator are graduating like dozens and dozens of companies per batch, like maybe like in addition to having like really cool tech luminaries giving speeches about whatever, inspirational speeches, we should have like a day where it's like, how do you make an environment that's friendly to all kinds of people, and like what kind of practices work best, and
Or 3 days.
Oh, okay.
yeah, or 3 days, or
So-
a week, or whatever.
A long period of time.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, 5 years ago, is it that a CEO like Satya wouldn't be talking about the issue, or he would have said something like that and the press wouldn't have freaked out like we did yesterday?
I don't know. I think we would have.
I don't think he would have gone 8 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe 5. But I mean, he spent like I think the entire day there.
Like, how big is? I mean, the Grace Hopper conference is much larger, if I understand, than it used to be, right? Like, yeah.
Yes.
Which is good.
And
you
he
know?
spent like 2 hours there. I mean, he
And
did
that's
a
the thing.
long time on stage. He didn't just blow in and blow out. Like he stayed there. And if you read the entire dialogue,
No.
he says, like, they talk about the female leaders at Microsoft, you know, the CFO, the head of HR, the business director, and so forth. And he said, like, one of these women, they're awesome, they're going to have my job someday. And so, like, he's not like, women can't do this job. He just had really dumb things to think and say about.
It's never malicious. It's just
Yeah.
oblivious, is what it is. And then
That's a
you
good word
have
for
to you have
it.
to call it out, and you have to say, like, I'm sorry that you're wrong, and then we need to have a discussion about it. And then we got to think, like, hey, maybe you should go back and look at all of the data inside of Microsoft and actually calculate how many men have asked for raises. Maybe that should be a thing that people should track.
This data you presented
know?
about 70% of your workforce being males, maybe you should think about that.
Right.
A little
No,
bit
but
more.
not even 70% of the people who are male. Maybe you should track how many of them have had promotions, how many
Right.
of them have had raises, how many
Right.
of them have asked for raises, how many of them, like, get deeper into that and kind of like look at, like, you know. Maybe you should track it to a T. You should be
So
like,
you would really
I'm
want an
sorry, female, you know, like, you
You
haven't
want an
asked for-
analytical CEO to do that. Some guy who's really good with data.
Yeah.
Maybe like Satya Nadella.
So I want to quickly touch upon something that was less of a surprise, but probably just as big, actually maybe more important to the company involved. Snapchat's users being hacked. News came out this morning that several third-party apps that, against Snapchat's terms of service, were accessing Snapchat's APIs, and thus people were using them on various platforms, whether in the web or Android or on Windows, using that to send and save pictures. Basically, all of their databases were hacked, and there's several million photos released.
Whose databases were hacked?
SnapSave and SnapSaved.
Okay.
Two different, change the capitalization on the save.
Okay.
Two sites that were both using this PHP library to access the APIs. So many of the things that were leaked were pictures of like sex between teenagers. I mean, is this like going to be a big problem for Snapchat or no?
I mean, it's a huge problem. You know, should they have provided stronger warnings about, I'm sorry, you're using third-party apps and these are not allowed, or should they have closed up loopholes that allowed those
That one.
apps to access?
No, and that's a good one. Is it they can say like, "Hey, we said don't do this," but it's like you could have
Did they
made
say
it
don't
not
do it?
possible.
Or did
No,
they-
it's part of their terms of service saying don't make third-party apps. We do not try to make this available to you. You're accessing this. They use the term illegally, but that's probably actually
Could they
inaccurate.
have actually technically closed?
That's something where I'm
access?
not sure. of
I'm sure they
particulars.
could have if they were competent. The entire point here is privacy and privacy. And if you can't guarantee that for your users, even against their own interests, because they want to use these third-party apps, you shouldn't let them.
We're out of time. This took a little bit too long on the very important subjects of Airbnb and Microsoft, but I do think it'll be interesting to see over the next couple of months whether teenagers who would be using it for privacy end up, leaving the service.